All right, ladies and gentlemen, Azizan-e-man, आपको आपके भाई आदिल राजा का सलाम पहुंचे. I welcome you all. We've got a special house guest today. Tony Gosling, the man himself, is with me today for a very interesting debate which we were having earlier. And we welcome you, Tony. Welcome to Mikasa.
Thank you.
So, Tony, we were earlier talking about Russia and the Russian alliance which they have formed with the Afghans, whom some of the Afghans tell you are Talibans, but well, that's an old concept, let me tell you. So they are Afghans, but these guys, during the 1980s, during the Cold War, were actually enemies, and the Afghans were the reason because of which the USSR's empire broke down into pieces. And so how come they have formed an alliance with their arch rivals, their nemesis, I would say?
Okay, so if we're talking about Russia and Afghanistan, I think we have to understand that Afghanistan was not the reason for the collapse of the Soviet Union.
All right.
It was around the same time, and it was part of it. But the main reason for the collapse of the Soviet Union is actually it had been planned ever since the Second World War to slowly collapse the Soviet Union. So the Cold War, in many ways, was a phony Cold War. So the idea is, if anyone is familiar with Philip Agee, the ex-CIA American agent who created, I think it's Covert Action Quarterly, it used to be called, the Covert Action magazine, which is still an excellent website, and I'm not sure if they do a printed magazine. His most famous book at the time that ruffled so many feathers, Philip's book, was called In Search of Enemies. Maybe it might actually have been John Stockwell, because they were working quite closely. Two ex-CIA officers worked very closely in exposing the Central Intelligence Agency in the 1970s and 1980s to the American public, what they were really up to. And so the enemy is Soviet Russia. Now you realise you can't really have a war. Henry Kissinger spelt this out very clearly in the 1950s with Soviet Russia. But what you can is you can build up tension, and you can demonize. You know, many of our TV series had the Russians and the Soviets as the enemies. Oh, they're so dangerous over there, the other side of the Iron Curtain. So the Soviet Union was basically a similar way to what happened in Britain, in a weird fashion. So the Soviet Union was communists took over the private businesses. All of the major industries were state-run, obviously, in the Soviet areas, in Soviet Russia. All of the major industries, steel, right the way down to car manufacturing, everything was run by the state. We had a similar thing happen here in Britain. After World War II, massive nationalisation of these traditional family businesses, car manufacturers, even the railway companies during the war. Second World War were run by businesses. They'd been created by families who'd raised money, excuse me, to start the railways. After the Second World War, just as in the Soviet Union, the Labour government, Clement Attlee, nationalised everything. So you've got a similar situation in the 1950s in Soviet Russia and in Britain. Britain had partly embraced this idea of state control. Now, in Britain, what happened with Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s was she then sold all this stuff that had been created by families originally in Britain, the railways, all these other industries, and the car manufacturing, aircraft manufacturing, was sold to the highest bidder all around the world. Okay, so it went from being family owned to owned by private equity companies, by hedge funds. And then the Western Empire was hoping the same was going to happen to Soviet Russia once perestroika came with Gorbachev. So the oligarchs were sent into Russia and into all parts of the Soviet Union to take over these state assets and bring them into the global financial system to take them over and own them. So that was really what happened in 1989, 1990,
so how do you define...
as the Soviet Union collapsed, is it was then began to be privatized.
All right.
Right? Into the global and the mainly Western financial system.
Point taken. That was we understand that was basically the contest was between capitalism and the communism. Fine. But how then you define the Afghan jihad or by the Americans, by the CIA and the Pakistanis, the ISIs, which was spearheaded by the Afghan Mujahideen, who are actually ruling Afghanistan right now. And they have now formed a security alliance with Russia. But first part of the question, how do you define that, that jihad, Afghan jihad in the 1980s and late 70s? How do you define that?
Well, have you watched Charlie Wilson's War?
Oh, yeah, I have. Yeah.
Okay, that's what was happening. Yeah. So the Muslim faith was being weaponized by MI6 and by the Central Intelligence Agency. They had private individuals who are out in the field operating to fund, and this is what often happens when there is a political dispute. You will find even CAFOD, the Catholic Fund for Overseas Development, turn up, hey, we're here to help with some aid. Oh, and by the way, here's a few £1 million or dollars for guns, right? So what they'll do is they will arm a faction that's involved in some sort of either an ethnic dispute, a border dispute, which will then kick off some form of a civil war. So this is how they like to, I think, originally fund and ignite civil conflicts that then they can start to manipulate that in one way or another. So that's what happened with Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan. The Americans came in and they basically armed at the time, the Mujahideen against the Soviet invasion. Now, this was partly to gnaw away at Soviet influence and power, to demoralize the Soviet hierarchy and leadership. Oh, we can't even take over Afghanistan. What kind of country is this? But it was a very successful operation, I think, in undermining also the Islamic faith. So the idea is that you can only have your faith with guns. I mean, they said the same, didn't they, basically in medieval times to the Knights Templar, the Catholic version of what we're seeing today, which is armed Catholics going around, peddling war in various places, fighting with Islam. Yeah. So what they like to do is take these ideas, these faiths, and then arm them, weaponize them. So not only put arms into people's hands, but also make them a powerful fighting force, which then, of course, undermines the faith itself. So when Christians are armed by the Templars, people are thinking, who are these Christians? They've come over here, they're killing people. We don't really have faith in them. Who are they? The same exact thing happened with, for example, with the Al-Nusra Front, with Al-Qaeda. So this is what the Americans and the British, I think mainly those two intelligence services have been doing over the years, is to arm these factions in order to undermine the faith ultimately. And so the British public is sold this thing of, oh, it's ISIS, it's Al-Qaeda, as this is Islam. They even call them Islamists, don't they? And so that effectively undermines the faith. It's a double-barreled gun, a double-edged sword. Yeah. So not only are you undermining the faith, you're also using these fighters to fulfill your geopolitical aims. And that's what they were doing with Afghanistan.
Very interesting, point taken. But coming to the second part of the original question, okay. Once you're talking about Afghanistan and Russia, and they were at one time fighting each other, the religion was armed, I agree, by the Western establishment, I agree. It's all part of the books now, it's all part of the history now, but 4.5 decades later, after huge and colossal amount of bloodshed, the same, warring factions or warring nations have now formed the security alliance. Good. How the tables have turned. Yeah. How do you see this going on, and what's the future of the security alliance? Because at the same time, Afghanistan has got close relation with Gulf countries, and Gulf countries have got close relations with the Americans. So how do you see this playing out? How do you define this security pact or partnership going forward?
Well, look, I don't know about you in the 1980s, right? But I had no idea of Operation Cyclone when it was actually happening. So these games are okay when they're covert. As soon as people start understanding, and this is our job as journalists, is to help the world understand what's going on. As the penny starts to drop, right, over maybe a decade, it's a very slow penny going down. Yeah. So what happens in both countries like Russia and Afghanistan is that the people realise what the British and the Americans have been up to, and Israelis obviously involved with those two countries, and they realise that it makes sense to form an alliance against. Okay, so when the British Empire was in full swing, many people in the occupied countries made a comparison with previous rulers, and they said, well, actually, we don't like the British. A bit like when the Romans turned up in Britain in 43 AD. There was lots of fighting going on amongst the individual tribes, but the Romans brought order to the situation. People could just get on and farm so long as they gave their tribute to the Roman Empire. The Romans tried to impose justice and order just as the British did in their empire once they conquered it. And so, you know, this I think has changed immensely since the Americans took over as the major. I mean, after the Suez Crisis and after the Second World War, the Americans clearly decided we are going to have most of this British Empire for ourselves. We're going to be the major sphere of influence in these areas. But they haven't really done that because they haven't got cooperation, because they're quite bullying by nature of what they're doing around the world. And so America has become a common enemy for many countries around the world. They're very much untrusted. They seem to be not deal ready, so their diplomats go around, they make deals that then get broken. And so I think a lot of what's brought this is very similar to communities, say for example in Northern Ireland. Once they realise who their enemy is, these various communities come together, and that's what's happened with Russia and Afghanistan. They've realised who the main problem is in the region, trying to control that part of the world, trying to extend their power there. I mean, obviously the Vietnam War as well and the Korean Wars have taught a lot of people in Asia what the Americans are really about. And so they've united. I think Russia and Afghanistan have united against, essentially, against the Pentagon and against the American unified command structure, which tries to dominate the planet now.
Yeah, well, very interesting. You can take a sip of your coffee for that, you know, and because I'm going to shift focus and it's going to get more intense.
Oh, no.
Because, yeah, you've just talked about the vulnerabilities of the great American empire. Yeah. So, during the recent Iran war or Iran conflict, Americans' vulnerabilities have been exposed like never before. This is what I believe, and I would like to have your opinion about it. Firstly, and secondly, while you're at it, I would also, like you to present us with your analysis of who's actually going to win this war, and if the American empire could actually really defeat Iran or not.